It's terrific to be back here in Calgary. It is Calgary, Chris, not Edmonton. Back here in Calgary today on an issue which deeply concerns all of us in this town, all of us in this province, indeed, all of us in the country. It is an issue, Chris described it as complex. Yes, it is complex, but it is also an issue which tends to be emotional. Maybe that's part of the complexity to which Chris was referring. And so it's quite often difficult to have really rational discussion on the ways to deal with emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, first, I really want to pay tribute to Chris and to all of the team on the Ecofiscal Commission. I think you've made a tremendous contribution to policy and to discussion in this country, and I thank you for that. So, as I said, my purpose this morning is to outline a little bit the rationality of the discussion. Science tells us that the world must reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases in order to avoid highly disruptive climate change in the future. Exactly when is not clear, but in the future, clearly we are facing a major issue. And green activists believe that greenhouse gases need to be cut fast, almost regardless of the economic costs of getting there quickly. And some oppose, in so doing, some dogmatically oppose increased Canadian oil production, and especially the pipeline transmission of bitumen. At the other extreme, some in the fossil fuel industry deny any need to restrict the use of fossil fuels over time in order to avoid climate change. The bulk of Canadians, I think, lie somewhere in between. We know that the world should reduce greenhouse gases and do not believe that Canada should have a free ride or a free pass in that reduction process. Canada should do its part. But most Canadians, and I think quite rationally, do not want to sacrifice very much in terms of current living standards in order to get there. Now, this problem is not new. This is a classic tragedy of the commons, which we have observed through history, and an issue then which we are dealing with, we must deal with today. Because in the undefined but perceived distant future, we know that there is tragedy ahead. But the cost of avoiding that future problem must be incurred today. And the issue is, in the area of greenhouse gases, just as it was in tragedy of the commons, the issue is how to reduce the cost of adjustment in the short run, or conversely, and perhaps equally importantly, how to increase the perceived current benefit from reducing greenhouse gases. Economic analysis may never convince people at the extreme ends of the spectrum on this debate, but it should help the bulk of Canadians to understand how best to achieve the goal of reducing greenhouse gases while continuing to slowly improve Canadian standard of living. And there are two key questions in this, those that have been addressed by the Ecofiscal Commission. What are the most efficient tools to reduce greenhouse gases that Canadians produce in the medium term at the lowest possible aggregate cost? And secondly, how do we pay for this? How do we raise national income in order to pay for the cost of reducing greenhouse gases? Now, the economist's answer to question 1 is to use the price system to alter the incentive of consumers and producers to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels as a source of energy. That can be done by taxes, but the main issue is to raise the price of the use of fossil fuels as a source of energy. The second way of addressing question 1, of course, is also to incent the use of non-fossil fuel energy sources through taxes or through subsidies or other means. Now, raising the price of fossil fuels in consumption or production can be accomplished efficiently through a carbon tax, or perhaps in a slightly more complicated fashion by cap and trade, or in the end, I think probably best by some hybrid of the two. And this price mechanism entails greater efficiency and lower overall cost by forcing reductions to take place only at the margin. And this is a better way to do it than through a whole series of particular regulations, although these may be necessary. But regardless of the tool chosen, adjustment takes time. Very rapid adjustment is costly, and raising the carbon price by increasing the tax over time facilitates adjustment at a reasonable cost. Now, carbon pricing mechanisms are the most cost-efficient way to reduce the emissions, but the cost is not zero. There are very real costs of doing it. Canadian consumers and producers must still pay for reduced reliance on fossil fuel energy. And that brings us to question 2, how do we raise national income in order to help people pay for that cost of reduction in order to achieve that longer-term goal of avoiding catastrophic climate change? In short, we raise national income by selling our hydrocarbons, the hydrocarbons which we produce, to foreigners at the highest possible market price. It is very important to combine carbon pricing policy with policies to gain the maximum economic rent on the sale of our hydrocarbon products to foreigners, including the sale of bitumen from the oil sands, while global demand for oil is robust and is still growing. That's what's very important to do in order to pay the cost of achieving that long-run benefit of avoiding catastrophic climate change. And at the present time, our inability to deliver the product from the oil sands to the highest price global markets reduces the pure economic rent that the industry and Canadians can collect on this sale. Hard to estimate exactly what that is, but it's roughly in the order of a minimum of 0.5% of GDP, possibly a full percent of Canadian GDP. The exact income foregone by Canadians will vary somewhat with market conditions, but at the moment it runs around $10 or $15 a barrel. That income, that gain, can help us as individual Canadians and as producers in Canada to pay for the cost of reducing our domestic consumption of fossil fuels which produce greenhouse gases. Because it's consumption that produces the problem, the consumption here and consumption worldwide that produces the problem, not the production or the transmission of fossil fuels. So if we could capture the lost rent and recycle that back into our economy, then the cost of adjusting to a low-carbon economy can be better managed by us all. With a higher national income, more jobs, and more growth, Canadians' resistance to paying more for electricity or other goods or services affected by carbon pricing can be reduced. In resisting the construction of pipeline capacity, green activists are actually making the cost of carbon-reducing policies harder to bear for all Canadians, and hence reducing the support for policies of reducing greenhouse gases. Similarly, in opposing carbon taxes, proponents of the development of our natural resource base at any cost are strengthening the opposition to the development and to pipelines. So what we really need then is to accept, A, it's going to cost us as a country to reduce our emission of greenhouse gases in what we consume, either in production, in home heating, or in transportation. And we need to do what we can to pay for it. Indeed, the best of all worlds, have foreigners pay for it by getting the maximum price that we can for the sale of our hydrocarbons while the market is there to do so. That is a pure economic argument. During the course of the day, we will have much more sophisticated arguments take place, I am sure, Chris, emphasizing the complexity that goes well beyond a simple economist bringing people understanding of what it is really in their best interest. Thank you very much. Sure. So Chris says that I can stand here and accept buns or whatever people have to throw.
So we've got 10 minutes or so for questions, so please, we've got a couple of microphones here. It's not often you get a chance to ask David Dodge a question where he has to answer in front of 185 people.
You've suggested that we need to take our guidance on climate policy from three groups of people: the extreme left, the extreme right, and the middle of citizens, pushing more towards the middle. I would suggest there's another group that needs to be considered, and in the same way that we consult you as an expert on economics, we should be consulting the experts on climate change, the climate scientists, and get their opinion as to how fast and how radical some of these choices we are making need to be.
Absolutely. The question of how fast we need to go, one thing we know is the faster we go, the more difficult and the more expensive the adjustment costs are. And so, absolutely, that's one of Chris's complexities. How do you balance? How do you balance the speed with the cost? And absolutely, the answer, part of the answer lies on the speed side, from the science side. On the cost side, it comes also from science and technology. How fast can we develop alternative sources? How rapidly can we actually reduce in production, which we have to do quite effectively, greenhouse gases in production of fossil fuels?
Thank you. Since nobody else is standing up, there is somebody else standing up. I'll just ask quickly as well, how do you balance the 35 to 50-year lifespan of a pipeline with the urgent need to get off of fossil fuels and the need to maximize our money from the sale of our fossil fuels right now? How do you factor that length of the asset into that equation?
And David, could I get you to answer that from the microphone? Thank you.
The simple answer is we have a world price. The tariff that the pipeline will bear, if you will, of a pipeline that it will bear, is the difference between our cost of production and the world price. And to the extent that you only have 20 or 25 years to recover the cost, the tariff on the pipeline has to be higher, and hence you want to use, whether it's a pipeline or whatever transportation mechanism, you want to use the mechanism that delivers the lowest tariff to take the product from where it is produced to the market. And it may be that you have to use a 25-year or a 20-year amortization in order to figure out the economics of doing the pipeline. Sir.
Hi, David. I'm wondering if you could comment. Canada is a small, open economy, and the U.S. is not really on board with some of the things that we're talking about here. How does that work, trying to implement the policies you talk about, outsourcing the high-value-added jobs and things like that?
No, absolutely. We live in a competitive environment. That's true not just in the energy sector, but in all sectors of our economy. And we're being challenged abroad at the moment on some aspects of what we're doing. And the answer is that the regulatory structure, let me put it that way, in the United States at the moment puts a much lower premium on reducing, dealing with climate change than we are willing, than we have put on in Canada. That is a public policy choice that the Americans have made. I think it's an unfortunate choice for the world, but it is a choice they have made. And in fact, we have to live with it, and we actually then cope the best we can.
So would you like to go to the left? We've got 4 people. Let's try to take
fast.
those and quickly.
Right. I have a couple of issues that I'd like to suggest. One thing is you're saying that in order to increase our income so that we can afford to pay carbon taxes, et cetera, we should sell off all these resources. What if we raised our royalties just to a reasonable level instead of the very lowest on the face of the earth? And how much could that increase our ability to pay whatever carbon taxes, as well as reducing the amount that we have to ship out to be burnt elsewhere? The other thing that I would like to question you about is the externalized costs of all the fracking that's happening across Alberta, for instance. This is illegal now in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France and all its territories, several states in the United States. Why are we allowing this? And we're not even looking at how much this is costing in degradation of our environment, our air, water, and soil, and health costs now and in the future.
So the health issue is I think, a very interesting one with respect to with hydrocarbons. So let me deal with that one. Clearly, getting off coal has brought immediate benefits that people can see. And you can see it in terms of reduced smog, and it's not just to the health system, it's that we as citizens can feel. And so that effort to get off coal, just as the British got off coal to reduce the killer London smogs, brought a benefit, and we could see it, and that was a really advantageous, in a sense, to do the right thing. Our big problem with greenhouse gases is we don't, that are generated, let's say, by production of electricity from natural gas, for example. We don't feel any change when we've made that, except something out there far in the future. And so we really do have a challenge in dealing with it, where we don't have an immediate benefit. And that is a challenge that we are going to deal with, and the next two panels will undoubtedly discuss it.
Carbon pricing a special case of the broader concept of pollution pricing. And if we're going to apply that concept to fossil fuels, should it not also be applied to other sources of energy? We're internalizing the negative environmental externalities of using fossil fuels, but not doing so for hydro, who, you know, the hydro dams in this country have flooded carbon sinks the size of Lake Ontario. We haven't done this for nuclear, which they don't produce greenhouse gases, but they produce one of the most deadly poisons known to man, and the federal government's invested billions of dollars in trying to figure out how to handle that. If we're going to apply this concept to fossil fuels, should it not be applied to all other energy sources? And if you don't, you internalize one externality but not for the others, you're sending the wrong signals to the consumer with respect to their use of energy.
Absolutely. That's classic economics 101, and it is absolutely... So absolutely, absolutely correct. That wasn't the issue that I was asked to address, but... Sir.
Concept of having foreigners pay the carbon price so that it's not a cost burden on the Canadian economy and Canadian taxpayers seems so elegant. But we have two challenges, and I'd like to get your understanding on. One is, of the top 10 exporting oil countries in the world, Canada is the only one with a price on carbon. And two, 99% of our export go to one market, the United States, which doesn't have a price on carbon. So if we are to export the carbon price to foreign customers, how can we do so in a way that continues to keep the Canadian industry competitive and attract capital, as opposed to seeing that flight of capital to other jurisdictions where there isn't that cost burden? How are we actually going to even develop the resource if it's too costly to investors?
If there is, I would turn that question around, because what you're saying is that the price that the foreigners are willing to pay, given their particular production source, whether it's United States or whether it's Saudi Arabia or whatever, the price that they're willing to pay, the issue for us is that still a price, that world price, at which we can make economic rent? And the answer is, it is still a price at which we can collect economic rent. There is a question of how to distribute that rent, and I think that was the previous question that had been asked. And absolutely, there's a question how to distribute that rent, and I didn't try to deal with the distribution issue, but the rent is there. It may not be as big as it would be if other jurisdictions forced up the cost of their production of fossil fuels, but nevertheless it's there, and we should capture it.
Good morning, David. One of the policy arguments that I often hear on social channels is Canada should be investing in renewable energy, the ever-popular wind, water, solar stuff, versus fossil energy. Now, my own take on this is that we will still derive greater economic benefit from the export of our fossil fuels than we could by attempting, for example, to become a solar panel producer, which won't happen because these things are a commodity. They're made in China, and I mean, I install these things by day out in the oil field. Go figure. But I'd like you to elaborate on how much better the return for Canada is on exporting fossil fuels rather than trying to trade in things like solar panels, where we are frankly at a disadvantage in my view.
Well, just in terms of pricing of solar panels, we cannot compete.
Exactly.
Let's be quite clear. Neither can the Americans at the moment, without intervening to block Chinese trade sale into the United States. But you raised a general question, and that is you want to invest at the margin where you get the greatest return. And at the moment, for us in this country, at the margin, the greatest return is still coming from investing in fossil fuels. That's the economic side. The political side is, yes, there are people that don't like the investment in the fossil fuels, but there are lots of people that don't like having big windmills turning beside their farm as well. And the photovoltaic generation at the moment is still intermittent enough that it's quite expensive to run a grid and fully incorporate photovoltaic generation of electricity.
Indeed.
Maybe the real solution will be when we discover how Mother Nature manages to convert sunlight energy into vegetable matter energy, and there's a lot of work going on that right at this time in Canada, and maybe that is the most terrific investment we can make. So if anyone wants to contribute to the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which funds that work, it would be much appreciated.
Sorry, David, I was just going to say that the one thing about solar power is, yes, it's gotten cheap, but the power it produces is not of very much value.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all. That was great.